In August 1993, a group of kayakers from Ukraine travelled to Irkutsk in southern Siberia. Whilst enjoying the river and scenery south of Lake Baikal, they came across something haunting: a 17-year-old girl covered in blood and mumbling incoherently about a tragedy that had befallen her and her friends. Her name was Valentina Utochenko, and the terror she survived still baffles experts who refer to the event simply as the Khamar-Daban Mountain Deaths. More than any other landscape, mountains seem to hold hidden threats beyond our comprehension. This is especially true in Siberia, a 5 million square mile expanse encompassing frozen tundra, deep forests, and dozens of mountain ranges. In its southern reaches lies an area few outside Russia have ever heard of, but that holds an unsettling reputation. The Khamar-Daban range is nestled along the southeastern edge of Lake Baikal, the oldest and deepest freshwater lake on Earth. There is no denying it is a place of staggering natural beauty, which is why it remains so popular amongst hikers and cross-country skiers. But Khamar-Daban is also known for being extremely treacherous. Regardless of the season, visitors often have to contend with thick fog, icy winds, and dramatic temperature changes that can drop below freezing in minutes, even in the middle of July. Long-time viewers will note that this is far from the first episode to focus on strange activities and events occurring near Russia's mountain ranges. Those familiar with the 1959 Dyatlov Pass incident, in which 9 Soviet students hiking in the Ural Mountains died under unexplained circumstances, will see more than a few parallels here. But there's also the Shivrui Pass disaster from 1973. Occurring in the Lavoy Zero massive range east of Finland, it saw 10 ski hikers from the Kuibyshev Aviation Institute perish. All were found frozen, with no signs of violence. And, as with Khamar-Daban, the victims of the Dyatlov and Shivrui Pass incidents were all highly experienced hikers and outdoor experts. But the similarities don't end there, as all the settings for the mysterious deaths were somehow sacred to the indigenous peoples living in the area. In the Dyatlov Pass case, the Mansi tribe called the area where the bodies were found Hulatsiakal, or Dead Mountain, and had entire legends dedicated to its haunting slopes. In Shivrui, the local Sami tribe held that Lavoy Zero Massive was a site of ancient power and was guarded by unpredictable nature spirits. The people of Khamar-Daban, the Buryat, told similar stories. Even in modern times, shamans warn travellers not to take the place lightly. They claim it is watched over by powerful beings, mountain spirits known as Izainas. These guardians are believed to respond harshly to disrespect, punishing arrogance with sudden illness, misfortune, or death. Other legends speak of the Master of the Tiger, a shape-shifting entity said to roam the forests, taking the form of man, animal, or sometimes just a swirling fog. The spirit is said to play tricks on those who dare to enter its domain, sometimes leading them in circles or clouding their minds with hallucinations. Once it's had its fun, it vanishes, leaving victims lost, cold, and alone. But for all the similarities between the 3 incidents, one thing sets Khamar-Daban apart. Someone survived. Unfortunately, when the kayakers got 17-year-old Valentina Utochenko back to civilization, the story she told defied belief. Valentina Utochenko had always loved the mountains. At just 17, she was already an experienced hiker, fit, capable, and quite familiar with the dangers of the Siberian wilderness. So when the opportunity came to join a summer trek through the Khamar-Daban Mountains, she didn't hesitate to go along. The group consisted of 7 people in total, including 6 young hikers aged between 15 and 24. Timur Bapanov was the youngest, followed by 16-year-old Victoria Zylyesova and Utochenko herself. Denis Shevachkin was 19, and Alexander Kayersin and Tatiana Filipenko were both in their early 20s. Valentina already knew most of the hikers quite well. Not only had they ventured out into the wild several times together, but many of them had become close friends. But the biggest reason Valentina simply couldn't say no to the trip was that it was being led by Lyudmila Korovina. The 41-year-old was something of a legend amongst young lovers of the outdoors in the area. Not only was she a master of sports in hiking, but she was widely respected in survivalist circles for her discipline, endurance, and leadership. In fact, her nickname amongst her students was Master. Valentina knew that going out into the woods with such an experienced leader would almost certainly make the hike more intense and would also provide opportunities to learn new techniques. One skill she was eager to acquire was mushroom foraging, a discipline in which Korovina was considered an expert. And so, in early August of 1993, the team boarded a train bound for Irkutsk, where they would begin their journey towards the range. Even though Khamar-Daban was often populated by tourists, they were well aware of its challenging reputation. As such, they made sure to pack ample food, proper cold weather gear, and carefully charted maps. Still, nobody in the group was particularly worried. The weather report had predicted sunshine, and they would be moving in tandem with a second team led by Korovina's daughter, Natalia. By all accounts, the first leg of the hike went exactly as planned. The group made excellent time, even reaching the summit of Retransliata Peak ahead of schedule. Next, they crossed the Longutai Gates Pass and made their way along the Baranyung-Katchuk River. Valentina was thrilled with the trip so far, as were her friends. Because they were ahead of schedule, they took a moment to enjoy the view from Hanolu Mountains Ridge. From 2,400 meters up, the slope provided an inspiring view of the Khamar-Daban range, which stretched out before them in an endless sea of pine and stone. Then, everything changed. On the 4th of August, the weather took a frightening turn. High winds swept across the ridgelines, slowing the team's progress to a crawl. That night, as they began a descent, they found themselves in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. Korovina called for the students to set up tents for the night, but because of their exposed location, they ultimately failed to build a fire. To make matters worse, they were now in danger of missing the rendezvous on the 5th of August with the second group. The next morning, they finally managed to get a fire going. They ate a warm breakfast and, still weary from a lack of sleep, set off again. Korovina had called the local weather station, which told them conditions would be clear, but they soon learned that wasn't the case. The entire way up the next mountain, they were pelted with rain and sub-zero winds, and as they made their descent, all hell unexpectedly broke loose. Valentina was in the middle of the group when Alexander Kayersin, who had been walking near the rear, suddenly let out a strangled scream. When she turned around, she saw him staggering and violently convulsing. To her horror, She could see blood streaming from his eyes and ears, and he was foaming uncontrollably at the mouth. After several seconds of this, he collapsed to the ground, where his body went limp and silent. Immediately, Lyudmila Korovina sprinted to his side, attempting to help him regain consciousness. However, upon reaching his body, she too began to seize. The rest of the group watched in stunned terror as their leader's eyes rolled back and her arms flailed in strange and unnatural ways. Moments later, she collapsed right on top of Kayersin's body. Valentina moved to say something to her friends, but before she could react, Tatiana Filipenko began screaming as well. As the other 4 hikers turned to look at her, they saw that she was frantically clawing at her own throat, almost as if she was suffocating. Moments later, as if possessed, she fell to the ground, staggered over to a nearby rock, and slammed her head against it several times in quick succession. Then, she too went limp. At this, the 2 youngest of the group, Victoria Zalyesova and Timur Bepanov, turned and ran in opposite directions. However, they didn't make it far before they both collapsed. From Valentina's vantage point, she could see they were both vomiting blood and tearing off their clothes, their faces twisted in agony. Grabbing 19-year-old Denis Shavachkin, the 2 immediately fled, running as fast as they could down the mountain. Unfortunately, the pair only made it a few meters before Denis also fell to the ground, where he lay twitching and gasping in the dirt. Valentina attempted to help him, but he too became unconscious and unmoving. With her body full of adrenaline and shaking with terror, she maneuvered her way down the slope as if on autopilot. She didn't stop to think about what had happened or consider her own survival until night began to fall. Knowing she had no choice, she removed the tent from her pack and camped under a small cluster of trees, waiting until morning. When dawn did come, Valentina did the unthinkable. She climbed back up. Though still in a state of shock, her wilderness survival had also begun to kick in. She knew she needed supplies, and so she returned to the bodies of her fallen companions and salvaged food, gear, and a map. Then she turned and headed downhill once again. Khamar-Daban was rough terrain, but it wasn't remote. Valentina could see power lines in the distance, and she knew that they would eventually lead her to civilization, and so she followed them for 4 days. Finally, on the 9th of August, she came upon a group of Ukrainian kayakers holidaying on the Irkutsk River. Upon seeing the blood-splattered girl stumbling along the banks near the forest's edge, they first thought she'd been attacked by a bear. According to them, she was pale, incoherent, and barely able to keep her eyes open. They immediately took Valentina to a nearby police station, where she was quickly admitted to a hospital. Though she was brought to the authorities immediately, she was in no condition to tell them what had happened to her, or to her fellow hikers. For half a week, she sat silently in the hospital, staring into the distance. It would be several days before she could bring herself to tell authorities what happened. When she did, her words brought more questions than answers. Her account came in fragments. She described her fellow hikers convulsing, screaming, and dying in rapid succession. But despite the urgency of what she was recounting, no formal search was launched until the 24th of August. Finally, 2 full weeks after Valentina had been rescued, helicopters were dispatched to sweep the area, but the Khamar-Daban is so vast, it took the rescuers another 2 days to locate the bodies. When they were found, they were just as Valentina had described. The corpses were scattered all over the slope, and most of them were partially undressed, their clothing either torn or removed. Autopsies revealed a strange assortment of injuries. All of the dead hikers had bruised lungs, and many of them had a protein deficiency due to malnutrition, which the autopsy technician said was likely a contributing factor in their deaths. Strangely, it was ultimately concluded that 5 of the hikers had died from hypothermia. Korovina, meanwhile, had died from cardiac arrest. Several of the bodies also showed signs of pulmonary edema, a fluid buildup in the lungs that can result from toxins, high altitudes, and acute respiratory distress. Thank you so much for watching Bedtime Stories and for listening to the Bedtime Stories podcast. Today I want to tell you about an incredible new podcast that's live right now, courtesy of my friends at Ball & Studios. And this one is a history show, but it's not one of those dusty old history shows that will bore you to death. These stories all feel like immersive action movies. Well, action movies you listen to. And the best part is that they all dive into moments that shape the world we live in today. For example, why are we obsessed with true crime stories? Wait till you hear the story from more than 100 years ago. It's not just the grisly murder, the daring escape, and the thrilling hunt that will suck you in. It's the way that story sparked our cultural obsession with true crime that makes it so much more fascinating. And that's just episode 1. These stories are all around us, the things we take for granted. If we just trace them back in time, they often lead to a singular moment, a twist that reverberates through history. The show is called A Twist of History, and it's live now. So go search for A Twist of History wherever you get your podcasts. Hit that follow button and start binging. New incredible stories come out every Wednesday. Rather than providing answers, the medical examinations only deepen the mystery. How could 6 healthy, physically fit hikers die within minutes of one another? If it was some sort of environmental phenomenon, how did Valentina make it out alive? Nothing in the official report could answer those questions, and neither could the survivor. After her rescue, Valentina all but vanished from public life. Though her ordeal made headlines across Russia, she never gave interviews, nor did she write any sort of memoir. For years, her name was little more than a footnote in a tragic story that most had quietly forgotten. While some assumed she was simply trying to move on, others suspected that she had been warned or even ordered not to speak about what had happened in the mountains. The Soviet Union had collapsed just 2 years earlier, and the political landscape was a mess. It's not impossible to imagine a local police chief or minister wanting to sweep the event under the rug. Whatever the case, it would be another 25 years before Valentina Utochenko broke her silence. In 2018, a curious reporter for Russian tabloid Komsomolskaya Pravda managed to track her down. She was still living in Russia, had married, and now had a family. When asked about the incident, Utochenko's initial reaction was hostile. She demanded to know why the reporter would dredge up such a nightmare, claiming she hadn't even told her husband about what she'd seen that day. Eventually, her tone softened, and she agreed to be interviewed. However, what was published was far removed from what was contained in her 1993 police report. She spoke of the cold weather and sudden panic, reporting that her friends all seemed to drop dead without warning. But this time there were no screams, blood, or details about clawing at throats or bashing heads on rocks. All in all, it was wholly anticlimactic. Some people theorized that she was still covering up the truth, just as she had for the past quarter century. Others argued that she'd had time to mature and deal with her trauma, and that the new, more rational story was most likely the truth. Still others put the blame on Valentina, claiming her survival is the smoking gun and therefore she is most likely responsible for the deaths of her friends. Even police records indicate that she was briefly considered a suspect, but those notions were eventually dismissed. After all, how could a young girl overpower and kill 6 other people, many of them older and stronger than herself? By all accounts, Valentina has nothing more to say on the matter. And so, like the Dyatlov and Shivrui Pass incidents, the story of the Khamar-Daban Mountain Deaths has slowly faded into obscurity. In the decades since the incident, a number of theories have been proposed. One of the simplest explanations is also the one found in the official reports: hypothermia. The autopsy concluded that all but one of the victims had died of exposure to extreme cold, with Korovina succumbing to cardiac arrest. The group had camped overnight in an exposed location during a severe weather front, and the combination of high winds and freezing temperatures could easily have triggered the first stages of hypothermia. It's well known that once a person's body temperature drops, the mind begins to suffer. Hallucinations, confusion, and what's known as paradoxical undressing are all common symptoms. This might explain why some of the bodies were partially clothed, and why the group's behaviour became so erratic. If hypothermia was to blame, its rapid onset could have been aided by the high altitude. Indeed, low oxygen and cold temperatures together can increase pressure in lung arteries and lead to fluid leakage. Of course, for this to be true, one has to ignore Valentina's first version of events, or at least some of it. For instance, she mentioned that Alexander Kayersin was foaming at the mouth when he collapsed. This is a well-established side effect of pulmonary edema. In fact, foamy discharge was also found in at least one of the Dyatlov Pass victims, where hypothermia was also given as the official cause of death. However, the bleeding from the eyes and ears is more difficult to explain. Such symptoms are more associated with pressure-related trauma, head injuries, or ruptured eardrums. Either she was mistaken, or Kayersin had suffered some other injury outside of hypothermia. It's also important to point out that hypothermia would rarely cause death in such rapid fashion as Valentina claimed. The question must also be asked as to why it would affect everyone at almost the same exact instant. So, if not hypothermia, what was to blame? 2 of the rescuers involved in the initial search proposed that altitude sickness must have been a factor. Though more commonly associated with higher peaks than the one the hikers were on, it's possible that extreme exhaustion and thin air could exacerbate underlying medical conditions or give rise to disorientation. In severe cases, it can cause swelling of the brain, confusion, and other debilitating effects. Still, many experts remain focused on the existence of pulmonary edema, which was noted in several of the autopsy reports. In an interview years later, Valentina Utochenko herself suggested this was a true cause of the deaths she witnessed. Pulmonary edema can strike suddenly, particularly when combined with physical stress, cold weather, and high altitudes. It might also explain the convulsions and difficulty breathing described in her earlier account. It's also true that it can slow down the heart to the point of failure, which may explain why Korovina, the oldest of the group by 17 years, had died of a heart attack. But the sheer violence of the deaths, convulsions, frothing at the mouth, screaming, doesn't align neatly with these clinical explanations. And this is where the theories begin to branch into more unsettling territory. Some suggest that the hikers were exposed to a chemical or environmental toxin, something capable of causing widespread physiological collapse. Indeed, the symptoms described by Utochenko bear a striking resemblance to those seen in cases of nerve agent poisoning. Korovina's sudden heart attack could also fit this scenario. The same goes for the bruising on the lungs. One name often mentioned in this context is Novichok, a family of nerve agents developed in the Soviet Union and allegedly tested in remote regions of Russia throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. According to some sources, Novichok testing grounds were located not far from the Khamar-Daban. If the hikers had unknowingly come into contact with residue from an old test site or wandered into the path of something still in use, it could explain the sudden and fatal onset of symptoms. But this theory runs into logistical problems. Khamar-Daban is a popular trekking destination. Would the military really conduct such secretive testing in a place that was so commonly frequented by the public? Another toxicological possibility suggests there may have been some sort of contamination in the group's food or water supply. Lake Baikal, though pristine on the surface, has been used as a dumping ground for industrial waste. The hikers could have ingested something invisible to standard testing, resulting in poisoning and rapid organ failure. The fact that Valentina was spared could be explained by something as trivial as her not drinking water that morning. Other people point to the possibility of mushroom toxicity. Korovina was an expert forager and reportedly taught her students how to identify wild edibles. But even seasoned foragers can make mistakes. A few misidentified mushrooms, especially in wet, degraded conditions, could have introduced lethal toxins into their breakfast. Hallucinogenic varieties like Amanita muscaria are known to cause confusion, convulsions, and even cardiac arrest in high doses. To make matters worse, some variants such as Amanita phalloides are virtually indistinguishable from safe species when young. Again, the fact that Valentina was spared could be due to not eating the same meal or simply not getting as high a dose. She was found remarkably close to the place where her comrades passed away. The fact that she was in the woods for 4 days and only travelled around 9 miles seems to support the idea she'd been poisoned with something. If that poison had hallucinogenic effects, that would explain why the events in her report were so frightening. Another popular theory focuses on katabatic wind, a phenomenon to which the Dyatlov Pass incident is also increasingly attributed. This is a rare but deadly occurrence, where cold, dense air rushes down a mountainside at tremendous speed. The winds can arrive without warning, creating hurricane-force gusts that strip away clothing, disorientate hikers, and drop core temperatures within minutes. Valentina herself recalled battling strong winds in the days before her group's collapse. However, if this was the cause, it's curious that she didn't mention it in her report, and even more unlikely that she would have survived. Even more obscure is the idea of infrasound. These are low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. Though silent to us, infrasound can have a profound physiological effect, triggering nausea, anxiety, hallucinations, and even panic attacks. Some natural sources of infrasound include seismic activity, wind tunnels, and interestingly, the resonance of mountain ridges. One study conducted in Germany in 2017 found that just 1 hour of sustained exposure to infrasound is capable of disrupting heart rhythm and damaging internal organs. If the group had been exposed to such a phenomenon, perhaps funneling through a mountain pass, they may have experienced a mass psychological breakdown with horrifying results. This might explain Filipienko's apparent self-injury, the frantic stripping of clothes, and the general panic. It could also account for the sudden collapse of otherwise healthy individuals without leaving behind any obvious trace. But infrasound affects everyone in different ways and over varying time periods, so it would be extremely unlikely that all members of the group would react in the same way at the same time. Finally, it would be a disservice to discuss this case without talking about Lake Baikal itself. We previously mentioned that this is the oldest and deepest lake in the world, but that's not all it is. For hundreds of years, people have reported seeing strange lights and unexplained phenomena in, above, and around the lake. Going back centuries, Russian folklore tells of water spirits called rusalki, drowned women who tempt the living into the depths. In modern times, stories have emerged of Soviet divers encountering humanoid figures beneath the surface. Described as silver-clad beings with domed heads and glowing fins, they have been dubbed the Lake Baikal swimmers. Many have theorized that they might be extraterrestrial in origin, and that they might have a penchant for abducting those who travel too near the lake. And what of the tales of the Buryat tribes, the mountain spirits, and the protective master of the tiger? Is it possible the Khamar-Daban group encountered something not of this world, or not of this dimension? Every explanation, natural or otherwise, leaves something unanswered. If it was the cold, why did they die so quickly? If it was a nerve agent, why was no residue detected? If it was mushrooms, why didn't toxicology reports detect this? Alone, the story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of the mountains, but against the backdrop of Dyatlov and Shivrui, it's difficult to argue against there being something we have yet to understand about the Russian wilderness. The mountains have always marked a boundary between safety and danger, the civilized and the untamed, but perhaps they are also a boundary between the known and the unknowable. In the shadow of the Khamar-Daban range, 6 lives ended in panic and pain, leaving behind a trail of clues that only seem to contradict one another. Valentina Utochenko may have survived, but her memories raise more questions than they answer. Was the group overwhelmed by something natural yet rare, or did they stumble into a force beyond comprehension? Whatever the truth, the Khamar-Daban Mountain Deaths remain one of Russia's most disturbing and enduring mysteries. May the souls of those who perished on that fateful day rest in eternal peace.